It didn't come with a public announcement or a royal procession. It arrived as a quiet, decisive signature behind palace doors. But when Prince William put pen to paper, reclaiming what once belonged to the crown, the silence itself became deafening. Because this wasn't just about a cottage, it was about power, legacy, and a line finally being drawn. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The order itself, according to those who claim familiarity with the inner workings of palace administration, was not impulsive. It was measured, deliberate, and timed with precision that suggested something far greater than a simple property dispute. Frogmore Cottage, once presented as a gesture of unity, a symbol of inclusion, had quietly transformed into something else entirely. Reports suggest that within royal corridors, the cottage had become a lingering question, an unresolved chapter that refused to close. Aides, it is whispered, had long debated its status, its symbolism, and the precedent it set for a monarchy increasingly under scrutiny. And yet, for years, nothing happened. Until now. Insiders claim the directive was framed not as an act of retaliation, but as a necessary correction, an effort to restore what some described as the natural order of royal assets. The lack of public explanation only intensified the intrigue. Why now? Why in such silence? Senior staff, according to murmurs circulating in administrative circles, were caught off guard not by the possibility, but by the finality of it. There was no gradual build, no visible negotiation, just a signature. And with it, a shift. Because beneath the surface, this move carried implications that stretched far beyond the walls of Frogmore itself. It spoke to a monarchy redefining its boundaries, tightening its grip, and perhaps most strikingly, signaling that certain lines once blurred would no longer be tolerated. Those familiar with the evolving dynamic between duty and independence suggest this moment had been building for years, shaped by decisions, departures, and a growing sense that something fundamental had been left unresolved. And as the reality of the order began to settle, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not an isolated action. It was a response. A culmination, a turning point that hinted at deeper tensions, unspoken grievances, and a recalibration of power that could no longer be postponed. But this wasn't simply about reclaiming a residence, it was about undoing a decision that had quietly reshaped the balance of power within the royal family. Long before it became a headline, Frogmore Cottage stood as a quiet sanctuary, gifted, restored, and presented as a gesture of unity. But beneath its peaceful exterior, it carried a symbolic weight far greater than its walls suggested. And now, that symbol was being stripped away. What many once saw as a simple residence tucked within the royal estate was, according to those familiar with the inner workings of the monarchy, never just a home. It was a statement, a carefully chosen offering meant to bridge divides, to signal acceptance, and to anchor a new chapter within the royal fold. When Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were granted Frogmore Cottage, it was presented as both a privilege and a promise, a place where tradition and modern identity could coexist under the Crown's watchful authority. But even in those early days, whispers lingered. Reports suggest that the extensive renovations, funded initially through public resources and later repaid, sparked quiet unease among insiders who questioned not just the cost, but the message it sent. Why invest so heavily in a residence tied to a couple whose path within the monarchy was still unfolding? Why place such symbolic weight on a property that would soon become a focal point of scrutiny? Over time, Frogmore transformed into something more than a residence. It became a symbol of connection, and eventually, a symbol of tension. When Harry and Meghan stepped away from their royal duties, the cottage did not simply lose its occupants, it lost its clarity of purpose. It lingered in a strange in-between state, neither fully reclaimed nor entirely relinquished. Insiders whisper that within palace discussions, it was often referred to as unfinished business, a quiet reminder of decisions that had not fully resolved themselves. The idea of ownership, of entitlement, of continued access all became points of silent debate. And as public narratives shifted, so too did the perception of Frogmore itself. What was once seen as a generous gesture began to look, to some, like a lingering contradiction. Could a couple who had stepped away from royal duty still remain tied to royal privilege in such a visible way? Those familiar with internal sentiment suggest that this question grew heavier with time, pressing against the very structure of how the monarchy defines loyalty and belonging. The cottage, once a bridge, had become a fault line, and as that tension deepened, it became increasingly clear that its existence in this unresolved state could not last forever. Because beneath the history, beneath the symbolism, there were actions, choices made while still connected to that space that would ultimately push everything to a breaking point. But what made this reclamation so explosive wasn't the property itself, it was what Harry and Meghan had done while still connected to it. When Harry and Meghan stepped away, it wasn't just a royal exit, it was a rupture that echoed through every corridor of the monarchy. And while the world saw a clean break, insiders whispered that the ties were never fully severed. What unfolded in those early days of departure, what many came to call Megxit, was presented as a decisive shift toward independence, a bold move to redefine identity beyond the weight of tradition. But behind that narrative, reports suggest something far more complicated was taking shape. The separation was never absolute. The lines between royal privilege and personal freedom remained blurred, uncertain, and increasingly contested. According to those familiar with palace discussions, the expectation from within the institution was clear. Stepping away meant relinquishing not just duties, but the benefits that came with them. Yet from another perspective, there appeared to be a different understanding, one where certain ties, certain access points, could remain intact despite the public exit. And it was within that gap between expectation and interpretation that tension quietly began to grow. The continued association with royal assets, particularly Frogmore Cottage, became a focal point of that unease. It wasn't simply about a residence anymore. It was about what that residence represented. Could someone exist outside the structure of the monarchy while still holding on to one of its most visible symbols? Insiders claim that this question lingered far longer than anyone anticipated, creating an undercurrent of discomfort that slowly intensified over time. Within the palace, opinions reportedly diverged. Some believed in maintaining a softer approach, allowing space for reconciliation and preserving a sense of connection. Others, however, viewed the situation as unsustainable, arguing that blurred boundaries threatened the very clarity that the monarchy relies upon to function. And at the center of this growing divide stood Prince William, whose stance, according to multiple accounts, began to shift. What may have started as patience gradually hardened into resolve. The idea of maintaining open-ended arrangements, of allowing exceptions to define the rule, began to feel less like compassion and more like vulnerability. Because with every passing moment, the absence of clear limits risked setting a precedent that could not easily be undone. And as whispers turned into concerns and concerns into quiet strategy, it became evident that the situation was approaching a tipping point. The fracture that had once seemed manageable was now widening, pulling at the structure of the institution itself. What had been framed as a personal decision was now echoing as a constitutional dilemma within royal ranks. And as those pressures mounted, the shift from passive discomfort to active response became inevitable. But the real turning point came when private frustrations began turning into calculated action behind closed doors. No cameras, no statements, just a closed-door meeting where decisions were made that would quietly reshape the future of the monarchy. And at the center of it all stood William, no longer waiting, no longer negotiating. What had once been handled through cautious conversations and careful restraint had now shifted into something far more deliberate, far more calculated. According to those who claim insight into these private discussions, the atmosphere inside those rooms was not one of panic, but of precision. This was not reaction, it was strategy. Over a series of tightly controlled meetings, Prince William is said to have engaged directly with senior advisors, legal experts, and those tasked with safeguarding the structural integrity of royal assets. The focus was no longer just on resolving a lingering issue, it was on ensuring that such ambiguity could never take root again. Frogmore Cottage, once the centre of quiet debate, became the starting point for something larger, a review of how Crown properties were governed, protected, and when necessary reclaimed. Reports suggest that the conversations extended beyond a single residence, touching on frameworks that define ownership, usage, and the boundaries between personal entitlement and institutional control. And within those discussions, a phrase reportedly surfaced again and again, reasserting control. It was not spoken lightly. It carried with it the weight of responsibility, the recognition that the monarchy as an institution could not afford prolonged uncertainty. Those familiar with the process describe a methodical approach, documents examined, precedents revisited, and long-standing assumptions quietly challenged. There was no room for hesitation, because every unresolved detail, every blurred line, had the potential to weaken the very foundation these structures were built upon. And as these layers were carefully analysed, a long-term strategy began to take shape, not one driven by emotion, but by necessity, not one aimed at individuals, but at preserving the integrity of the Crown itself. It was within this context that William's role began to transform. No longer simply the heir observing from a distance, he was stepping forward as a decision-maker, someone prepared to act where others had delayed. Insiders suggest that this shift did not happen overnight, but once it crystallized, it moved with unmistakable force. The era of waiting had ended. The era of defining had begun. And as the final pieces of that strategy were set into place, the decision to act was no longer a question of if but when. Because once a structure is tested, it either adapts or fractures. And in this case, adaptation meant action. But signing the order was only the beginning. What followed would ripple far beyond palace walls. The moment the decision took effect, the reaction was immediate and impossible to contain. What had been handled in silence suddenly erupted into a storm of speculation, backlash, and quiet fury. Within hours, the narrative had escaped palace walls and taken on a life of its own, with global headlines attempting to decode what the monarchy itself had chosen not to explain. Reports suggest that the absence of a formal statement only intensified the response, allowing interpretations to spiral in every direction. Some voices framed the move as a long overdue act of discipline, an assertion that the Crown as an institution cannot function on exceptions and blurred boundaries. Others, however, saw something far more severe, describing it as a symbolic exile, a message delivered not just through policy, but through unmistakable consequence. And somewhere between those opposing views, the truth seemed to fracture into competing realities, each one shaped by loyalty, perception, and the weight of public emotion. Insiders whisper that within the royal family itself, the atmosphere grew noticeably colder. Communication, already strained, reportedly became even more distant, with interactions reduced to the bare minimum required by protocol. The relationship between Prince William and Prince Harry, once defined by shared history and unspoken understanding, now appeared to exist under a shadow of unresolved tension. Those familiar with the situation describe it as icy, not in the sense of open conflict, but in the absence of warmth, the quiet withdrawal that speaks louder than confrontation. And beyond the personal dimension, the public debate only grew louder. Was this a necessary step to protect the integrity of the monarchy, or a harsh move that risked deepening an already painful divide? The question echoed across platforms, fueling discussions that extended far beyond the individuals involved. Because at its core, this was no longer just about a property or a decision, it was about what the monarchy represents in a modern world. Authority versus empathy, structure versus flexibility, tradition versus change. Each argument carried weight, and each perspective revealed a different facet of a system under pressure to redefine itself. Yet, as the noise reached its peak, there remained an undeniable sense that the reaction, however intense, was only part of a much larger shift. Because decisions like this do not exist in isolation. They are signals, carefully constructed and deliberately timed, meant to communicate something deeper than their immediate impact. And as the headlines continued to clash and opinions hardened into positions, the real significance of the moment began to emerge, not in what was said, but in what was being implied. But beneath the headlines and reactions, a deeper message was being sent, one that spoke directly to the future of the monarchy itself. This wasn't just about Harry and Meghan. It was a statement, a carefully calculated signal about what the monarchy stands for and what it will no longer tolerate. Beneath the surface of a single decision lay a broader philosophy, one that insiders suggest has been quietly guiding the institution through one of its most uncertain modern chapters. The reclamation of Frogmore Cottage, while outwardly tied to a specific circumstance, carried a message far more expansive, one rooted in the enduring principle that duty must always outweigh personal preference. For generations, Crown assets have not been viewed as possessions to be claimed or retained based on individual circumstance, but as elements of a larger system held in trust, preserved for continuity, and governed by rules that extend beyond any one figure. And in this moment, according to those familiar with the evolving mindset within the palace, that principle was being reaffirmed with unmistakable clarity. Prince William, long seen as a steady presence preparing for future responsibility, appeared to step decisively into a more assertive role, one defined not just by inheritance, but by action. Reports suggest that this shift reflects a broader internal recalibration, where flexibility is giving way to structure, and where the boundaries of royal roles are being reinforced with greater precision than before. This is not, insiders claim, a rejection of modernity, but a response to it, a recognition that in a rapidly changing world, the monarchy must define itself more clearly than ever. And in doing so, it must draw lines that cannot be easily crossed or reinterpreted. The influence of Queen Elizabeth II is said to loom large over these developments, not through direct instruction, but through the legacy she left behind, a framework built on consistency, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to the institution above all else. Those who observed her reign often speak of a quiet strength, a refusal to allow personal dynamics to override the greater purpose of the crown. And now, that same philosophy appears to be guiding the decisions of the next generation. What makes this moment particularly significant is not just the action itself, but what it represents for the future. It signals a monarchy that is becoming more defined, more structured, and perhaps less willing to accommodate ambiguity. It marks a turning point where leadership is no longer shaped by hesitation, but by conviction. And as that conviction takes form, it reshapes not only internal dynamics, but public perception as well. Because in the end, the monarchy is not just an institution, it is a symbol. And symbols rely on clarity to endure. But even as the crown reasserted control, questions lingered about reconciliation, loyalty, and what comes next. Behind the formality and protocol lies something far more human, a fracture that may never fully mend. Because this decision wasn't just strategic, it was deeply personal. What unfolded through directives and quiet enforcement carried an emotional weight that no official language could conceal. Because at its core, this was not simply about policy, it was about two brothers whose paths had diverged so sharply that even shared history could no longer bridge the distance. The tension between Prince William and Prince Harry has long been described in measured tones, softened by public statements and carefully chosen words. But insiders suggest a far more complicated reality, one shaped by disappointment, conflicting values, and a growing sense that what once held them together was no longer enough to hold them in place. Reports of limited communication, of conversations reduced to necessity rather than connection, point to a relationship that exists more in memory than in the present. And yet, what makes this fracture so profound is not just its existence, but its visibility. The world watches, interprets, and forms its own conclusions, while the truth remains guarded behind layers of discretion. Public narratives continue to shift, sometimes portraying distance as mutual understanding, other times as irreparable division, but those familiar with the situation suggest that the reality lies somewhere in between, unresolved and constantly evolving. Because family conflict, especially at this level, does not follow a clear script. It lingers, it reshapes itself, it resists closure. And within the structure of the monarchy, that complexity becomes even more difficult to navigate. Duty demands clarity, consistency, and a firm adherence to roles, while personal bonds resist such rigidity, pulling in the opposite direction with quiet persistence. This creates a tension that cannot easily be resolved, one where every decision carries both institutional and emotional consequences. The reclamation of Frogmore Cottage, in this sense, was not just a boundary being enforced, it was a reflection of that deeper struggle, where the need to protect the crown collided with the reality of familial ties. Questions about reconciliation continue to surface, often framed with cautious hope, but without clear answers. Can a relationship shaped by such public and private strain find its way back to something resembling unity? Or has the distance grown too great, the differences too entrenched? Those questions remain unanswered, hanging in the space between what is said and what is felt. And as time moves forward, the absence of resolution becomes its own form of presence, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. Because in the end, this is not just a story about decisions and consequences. It is a story about people, bound by history, separated by circumstance, and navigating a reality where the cost of duty is measured not just in actions, but in what must be left behind. And as the dust begins to settle, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: the monarchy has entered a new era. The signature has been made, the decision enforced, and now the monarchy moves forward changed, hardened, and more defined than ever before. What began as a quiet directive has now settled into something far more permanent, a shift that insiders suggest will shape the institution for years to come. At the centre of it stands Prince William, no longer viewed simply as the future of the monarchy, but as an active force within it, decisive, measured, and increasingly willing to act where hesitation once lingered. This moment, according to those who observe the evolving structure of royal leadership, marks a transition not just in authority but in philosophy. The boundaries that once seemed flexible, open to interpretation, have now been drawn with unmistakable clarity. And with that clarity comes a new understanding: the monarchy, as an institution, will prioritize its preservation above all else. This does not mean abandoning compassion or connection, but it does signal a recalibration, one where personal ties must exist within the framework of duty, not beyond it. The ripple effect of this decision is already being felt, not just within palace walls, but in the way the public interprets the role of the crown itself. Some see strength in this firmness, a necessary evolution in a world where tradition must defend itself against constant scrutiny. Others see a loss, a narrowing of the space where personal relationships once coexisted with institutional demands. Both perspectives, in their own way, reveal the complexity of what has taken place. Because decisions like this do not offer simple conclusions, they create new realities. They redefine expectations, and perhaps most importantly, they leave behind a legacy that will be examined, debated, and understood differently over time. What remains undeniable, however, is that this moment represents a turning point. A line has been drawn, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that carries its own weight. And as the monarchy steps forward from this point, it does so with a clearer sense of identity, shaped not just by history, but by the choices being made in the present. The era of ambiguity is fading. In its place stands a structure more defined, more deliberate, and perhaps more resilient, because in institutions built on legacy, every decision becomes part of the story they tell about themselves. And this decision, in all its complexity, will remain as a marker of a time when the crown chose definition over uncertainty, action over hesitation, and structure over compromise. Because in the end, this was never just about a cottage, it was about who truly holds the power. and what the Crown is willing to protect at all costs. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.